Elias Thorne didn't mind the silence. After 22 years as a combat engineer in the Marine Corps and another 25 running a structural salvage firm in the heart of Pennsylvania, he had learned that silence was usually where the truth lived. It was the noise you had to worry about, the screech of a failing load-bearing beam, the whistle of an incoming mortar, or the high-pitched, frantic bargaining of his two children. Marcus and Serena sat across from him in the sterile, glass-walled conference room of a Philadelphia law firm. Marcus, a venture capitalist with a jawline as sharp as his predatory instincts, checked his Patek Philippe for the third time in 10 minutes. Serena, a top-tier luxury real estate broker whose skin was pulled tight by expensive procedures, tapped a French manicured nail against her iPad. "Dad, be reasonable," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devoid of any real warmth. "The house in Bucks County is a liability. It's 4,000 square feet of maintenance that you can't handle anymore. We've already signed the intent to sell. We've secured you a premium suite at the Heights, full medical staff, a putting green, and people your own age." Elias looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had built bridges in the Mekong and reinforced bunkers in the desert. They were thick-knuckled, scarred by welding sparks and cold chisels. "I built that house with my own 2 hands, Marcus. Your mother's roses are still blooming in the south garden." "And they'll be beautiful for the new owners," Serena countered, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We need to liquidate the estate now while the market is peaked. We've already moved your things into storage. You just need to sign the power of attorney." They didn't mention that Marcus's latest tech fund was hemorrhaging cash, or that Serena's divorce was stripping her of her penthouse. They didn't have to. Elias could see the structural cracks in their lives as clearly as he could see a failing foundation. They weren't protecting him. They were scavenging him. "I won't be going to the Heights," Elias said quietly. "Then where will you go?" Marcus snapped. "You don't have the liquid capital to buy a doghouse in this zip code after we settle the back taxes on the firm." Elias stood up. He felt the familiar ache in his lower back, the price of a life spent carrying the weight of others. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled deed transfer from a county tax auction he'd attended in secret 3 weeks ago. "I bought a place outside of Blackwood Creek, an old flour mill on the edge of the ravine." Serena let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "The old Sterling Mill? Dad, that's a heap of wet rot and rusted iron. The county has been trying to condemn it for a decade. It's a death trap." "I paid $7 for it, the exact cost of the filing fee. No one else bid. Everyone said the land was poisoned and the structure was beyond saving." $7, Marcus sneered. "That's about what your dignity is worth right now. You're going to die in a pile of rubble, and we aren't coming to dig you out. I've spent my life fixing things people said were broken. I think I've got one more job in me." Elias moved into the mill on a Tuesday in late October. The air in Blackwood Creek was heavy with the scent of damp hemlock and old iron. The mill was a massive 4-story skeleton of hand-hewn oak beams and local fieldstone, perched precariously over a rushing tributary. It hadn't groaned under the weight of grain since the 1940s. His children left him nothing but his old tool chest, a cot, and his Marine Corps footlocker. They kept the mahogany furniture, the silver, and the memories. The first week was a battle of physics. He didn't start with the aesthetics. He started with the logic of the water. The lower level was flooded with 6 inches of stagnant silt. Using a manual sump pump, he cleared the basin, his chest burning with the effort. He spent 16 hours a day inspecting the mud sills, these massive horizontal timbers that formed the base of the structure. To any layman, they looked like rotted driftwood, but Elias, using a long-handled awl, poked at the heartwood. It was black as midnight, but hard as iron. "White oak," he whispered to the shadows, "you're still holding." He spent his meager Social Security check on bags of Type N lime mortar and hydraulic cement.
He didn't have a crew, so he rigged a series of pulleys and block and tackles to the overhead joists, using the same mechanical advantage principles he'd used to pull Humvees out of the mud in '91. He worked with a rhythmic military precision: assess, stabilize, secure. He spent 3 days just repointing the foundation stones. He scraped out the crumbling, sandy mortar of the 19th century and packed in the new mixture, finishing the joints with a concave tool to ensure water shed away from the stone. Every evening, he sat on his cot, eating cold beans from a can, his joints screaming, watching the moon through the holes in the roof. His children didn't call. They were too busy listing his life's work on the auction block. By the second month, Elias had stabilized the main floor. He'd replaced the shattered floorboards with reclaimed hemlock he'd salvaged from an old barn down the road. He was working on the basement's west wall, a section that didn't make sense. The mill was built in 1882 according to the lintel stone. The masonry was consistent throughout, rough-cut field stone. But behind the massive rusted gears of the main drive shaft, there was a section of brickwork that looked different. The bricks were over-fired clinkers, darker and more vitrified than anything produced locally, and the pattern was a Flemish-bond, alternating headers and stretchers that was far too sophisticated for a rural grain mill. Elias took his masonry hammer and tapped. Thud, thud, hollow. He frowned. According to the exterior measurements, that wall should have been 6 feet of solid earth and stone against the ravine side, but the sound told a different story. There was a void. He spent the next 6 hours carefully chipping away at the mortar. He didn't use a sledge. He used a hammer and a cold chisel, working the head joints first. He was careful not to disturb the structural integrity of the archway above it. As he pulled away the 4th brick, a rush of cold, perfectly preserved air hit his face. It didn't smell like rot. It smelled of oil, old paper, and something metallic. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it through the gap. The beam traveled 20 feet before hitting a wall of reinforced concrete, steel-lined and bolted with heavy rivets. But it was what was etched on the steel that made Elias's heart skip a beat. It was the seal of the United States Department of the Treasury, dated 1942.
Elias stared at the seal. In his years with the Corps, he'd seen things that weren't on any public map. Hardened silos in the Midwest and sub-basements in D.C. that didn't exist on blueprints. This vault door was War Department surplus, the kind of over-engineered steel meant to survive a direct hit from a Luftwaffe eccentric weight bomb. His hands, slick with sweat and stone dust, shook slightly as he reached out to touch the hand crank. It was seized. Decades of humidity had fused the iron gears into a single calcified mass. He didn't rush. A Marine knows that force without finesse is just a way to break your tools. He spent the next 4 days in a methodical siege of the door. He used a mixture of acetone and automatic transmission fluid, a home-brewed penetrating oil, to soak the hinges and the locking lugs. He applied heat with a propane torch, watching the steel expand and contract, listening for the microscopic tink of the rust bonds snapping. He worked with a cheater pipe, a 4-foot length of galvanized steel slipped over the handle to increase his torque. "Come on, you old mule," he grunted, his boots slipping on the wet silt floor. He put his entire weight into the lever, his quadriceps burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound was like a pistol shot. Clack! The wheel budged 1/8 of an inch, then an inch. Then it began to spin with a rhythmic, grinding protest. As the 3-inch locking bolts retracted into the doorframe, the heavy steel slab swung inward on silent, grease-packed hinges. Elias stepped inside, his headlamp cutting through a darkness that had been undisturbed for 80 years. The room was 20 by 30 feet, lined entirely with copper sheeting, a Faraday cage. It wasn't full of gold bars. It was full of crates, sturdy, olive-drab wooden crates stacked to the ceiling, each one stenciled with "Property of U.S. Mint, Strategic Reserve." Elias pried the lid off the nearest crate with a crowbar. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper, were heavy rectangular plates made of polished steel and chrome. He pulled one out. It was an engraving plate for a 1934 series gold certificate. He opened another, silver bullion bars, each stamped with the eagle of the United States. He opened a third, smaller box. Inside were heavy, leather-bound ledgers. He realized then what he had found. In 1942, fearing a coastal invasion or the fall of Washington, the Treasury had quietly dispersed its master assets, the plates used to print the nation's currency and the silver reserves used for high-priority war tech, to obscure inland locations. This mill hadn't just ground flour, it had been a ghost mint, a failsafe for the American economy. The value of the silver alone was staggering, but the numismatic value of the original master plates, they were priceless artifacts of national security history. But Elias didn't call the police, and he didn't call the government. Not yet. He closed the vault door, wiped his tracks, and went back to work on the mill. He had a different kind of foundation to build. 2 weeks later, the silence of Blackwood Creek was shattered by the roar of a high-performance engine. A white Range Rover bounced down the rutted dirt track, followed by a black Mercedes sedan. Marcus and Serena stepped out looking like displaced royalty in the mud. They didn't look at the mill with disgust this time. They looked at it with predatory curiosity. Word had traveled to the city that the crazy old man had been buying massive amounts of high-end construction materials and that the ruined mill was now standing straight and tall. "Dad," Serena said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she stepped on the newly reinforced porch, You've really done something here." "I fixed the rot, like I said I would," Elias said, not looking up from the oak railing he was sanding. Marcus walked to the edge of the creek, eyeing the massive water wheel Elias had restored. "The county records say this property is zoned for historic industrial. We did some digging. If this place is functional, the land value triples. And with the vintage aesthetic, we're looking at a boutique hotel or a high-end distillery site." "It's not for sale," Elias said. "Dad, don't be stubborn," Marcus said, turning around. His eyes were cold. "We've filed a petition with the court for emergency conservatorship. We're arguing that your recent spending spree and your refusal to move into assisted living are signs of cognitive decline. The $7 purchase? It looks like a mania, Elias. We're going to take over the management of your assets for your own protection." Elias finally looked up. He felt a cold, familiar calm. "You want the mill?" Serena said, her eyes wandering to the basement stairs. "And we heard you found something down there. The local hardware store owner said you were asking for heavy-duty lubricants for a vault door. Is there a safe, Dad? What's in it?" "See for yourselves," Elias said, tossing Marcus a heavy iron key he'd forged for the basement gate. "It's in the west wall. Everything you think you're entitled to is right behind that door." The two siblings didn't wait. They practically ran for the stairs, their expensive shoes clattering on the hemlock floors. Elias stood on the porch listening to the sound of their greed. He heard them reach the basement. He heard the heavy iron gate creak open. He waited until he heard Marcus's muffled shout of triumph from deep within the foundation. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called 30 years, a direct line to a retired brigadier general he'd served with, a man who now sat on the board of the National Treasury Historical Association. "General," Elias said, his voice steady as he watched the sun begin to set over the ravine. "It's Thorne. I've recovered the 1942 dispersal cache. Yes, the ghost mint. I need a recovery team and a legal escort to the Blackwood Creek property. And General, there are 2 intruders currently attempting to tamper with federal property. I'd like them handled by the book." Elias walked down the stairs, but he didn't go to the basement. He went to the main electrical panel he'd just installed. He reached for the master breaker. "You wanted to see the light, kids. Now let's see how you handle the dark." He flipped the switch, plunging the mill into a tomb-like blackness. A moment later, a terrified scream from Serena echoed up from the bowels of the earth. The darkness in the basement of the Sterling Mill was absolute. Down there, 30 feet below the waterline and encased in 4 feet of Victorian masonry, there was no ambient light from the moon, no hum of the modern world. There was only the sound of the creek rushing past the exterior walls and the frantic, wet-lung gasps of Marcus and Serena. "Dad, turn the lights on!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking. He had been trying to pry silver bar from a crate when the power cut. In his haste, he'd tripped over the massive steel doorsill, sent his $500 loafers flying, and was now crawling on a floor slick with 80 years of condensation. "Elias, this isn't funny," Serena wailed. She was huddled against the copper-lined wall, the ghost mint treasures surrounding her like a gilded cage. "I can't see! I'm going to have a panic attack!" Above them, Elias sat in an old wooden rocker on the porch, his marine field jacket zipped against the mountain chill. He listened to them through the floorboards. For 30 years, he had provided the light for them. He had built the foundations of their lives, shimmed their failures, and reinforced their weaknesses. He had been the structural support they took for granted. Now he was letting them see what happens when the support is withdrawn. 15 minutes later, the forest road erupted in a parade of white light. 4 black SUVs with government plates swept into the clearing, followed by a heavy-duty transport truck, a helicopter, its searchlights slicing through the hemlock trees like a divine finger, hovered over the mill, the downdraft whipping the fallen leaves into a frenzy. Elias stood up as a man in a crisp charcoal suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. Beside him was General Holloway, an old friend whose face was a map of every desert campaign they had survived together. "Elias," the general said, taking his hand in a grip that could crush stone, "you always had a knack for finding the one thing everyone else overlooked." "It wasn't lost, Arthur," Elias said, nodding toward the basement. "It was just waiting for someone who knew how to maintain the gear." The federal agents moved with silent, terrifying efficiency. They didn't use flashlights, they used high-end night vision optics. When they descended into the basement, Marcus and Serena weren't greeted by their father's forgiveness. They were greeted by the muzzles of tactical rifles and the cold snap of zip ties. "Wait, you don't understand," Marcus hollered as he was dragged out into the mud, his silk shirt ruined, his face smeared with grease. "That's my father. We own this property. We're the conservators." The man in the charcoal suit, a lead investigator for the Treasury, stopped and looked down at Marcus. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, this property was designated a National Security Annex in 1942. Under the Emergency Banking Act and the subsequent Historic Preservation Mandate, a discovery of a Class A dispersal cache triggers an immediate federal eminent domain override for the structure, while the finder's custodianship remains with the deed holder. And since you were found attempting to remove strategic assets from a sealed federal vault, you aren't conservators, you're looters. In a time of heightened national security, that carries a mandatory minimum of 20 years. Serena began to sob, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "Dad, tell them we were just looking." Elias didn't look at them. He was looking at the mill. He was thinking about the thrust washers he needed to machine for the main turbine, and the way the Babbitt bearings in the old grindstone needed to be re-poured with molten lead to ensure a smooth spin. "I told you," Elias said quietly as the agents loaded his children into the back of the SUVs. "I've spent my life fixing things people said were broken. But some things, the rot goes too deep. You have to cut it out to save the structure." By dawn, the government had cordoned off the site, but they didn't evict Elias. Because of his background in structural salvage and his high-level security clearance, the Treasury Department issued him a special consultant contract. He was appointed the lifetime warden of the Blackwood Creek National Vault. The worthless $7 mill was now the center of a multi-million-dollar federal restoration project. The government paid for the finest materials, grade A heart pine, custom-forged ironwork, and a state-of-the-art security system that Elias personally oversaw. His monthly stipend for site maintenance was 5 times what Marcus had ever made in a year. 6 months later, the mill was a masterpiece. The water wheel turned with a silent, hypnotic power, generating enough electricity to power the entire valley. The stone walls had been repointed with a custom epoxy lime blend that would last another 2 centuries. Elias sat at his handmade oak desk in the loft, looking at a letter from a prison in upstate Pennsylvania. It was a plea for bail money, a plea for a second chance. Elias didn't open it. He knew that in any build, you can't reuse wood that has been eaten by termites. You have to start fresh. He stood up, picked up his grease gun, and headed down to the basement. There was a slight gear lash in the secondary drive that only he could hear. It was a small problem, a mechanical whisper, but Elias Thorne knew that a life, like a mill, is only as strong as its smallest moving part. He stepped into the vault, the silver gleaming in the warm LED light, and got to work. He was finally home, and for the first time in his life, the foundation was unbreakable.
Every story we share here is a piece of a lived truth, finally whispered out loud. If today's journey resonated with you, please subscribe to Quiet Drama Stories and leave a like. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your support ensures that these quiet voices are finally heard. Thank you for listening. And remember, you are never as alone as you feel. See you in the next story.